The history of mankind, recorded in ancient laws, is not just a collection of rules, but also a powerful mirror that reflects not only wisdom, the desire for order and development, but also the sometimes astonishing cruelty, deep-rooted prejudices, and blatant injustice that were the absolute norm in the past. What thousands of years ago was considered completely fair, reasonable, logical, and absolutely necessary for maintaining social order, stability, and the functioning of society, today evokes feelings of deep horror, disgust, and complete incomprehension in modern man. These ancient laws, whether carved in stone, written on clay tablets, papyrus, or parchment, show us how radically and profoundly our fundamental notions of justice, the inalienable rights of man, the purposes and methods of punishment, and the very concept of human dignity have changed. They were a direct product of their time, reflecting the dominant worldview, rigid social structure, religious beliefs, often deeply rooted superstitions, and the general level of technology, science, and thought of those societies. From laws where blood feuds were not just a savage practice, but a legally enforceable right, to rules where a person's social status determined literally everything: their rights, their opportunities, their obligations, and, most terribly, even the nature and severity of punishment for the same crime. We will see a world where individual life was valued very differently than it is today, and where the concept of universal equality before the law was completely alien and unthinkable. Diving into these ancient legal codes allows us not only to greatly expand our knowledge of the past, but also to better understand the long, thorny, and often bloody path that humanity has traveled to arrive at the relatively humane and fair principles of law and morality that guide us today. We will see how social norms, beliefs, and traditions shaped legal systems, and how these systems, in turn, supported and reinforced these norms, creating an often cruel, inflexible, and uncontested vicious circle. Many of these laws were based on the primitive, but seemingly fair and understandable principle of an eye for an eye. But very often they went far beyond this, allowing for punishments that today are considered inhumane, degrading, and completely disproportionate to the crime committed. Their deep study is not just an academic interest, not just a look at a set of dry historical facts, but also a vital lesson about the dangers of neglecting individual rights, how easily a society can slide into despotism and tyranny, and the importance of constant progress in understanding human dignity and the need for its comprehensive protection. It is a vivid and eternal reminder that even the most established, seemingly unshakable norms and traditions can be revised and condemned by subsequent generations, emphasizing the importance of continuous critical reflection on any legal system and its compliance with changing notions of humanity and justice. The first law was the law of Talion, the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, known as the law of Talion, from the Latin talio, retribution equal to the injury suffered, is one of the oldest and best-known legal principles found in the earliest written codes and legal documents, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi in Babylon, dating from around BCE. The principle is also prominent in Hebrew law, as found in the books of the Old Testament. At first glance, the principle seems intuitive, simple, and even fair in its literal simplicity, implying direct and equal retribution for the injury suffered. If you take away someone's eye, your eye shall be taken out too. If you break someone's bone, your bone shall be broken too. Initially, this was perceived as an attempt to introduce some measure, some limit to uncontrolled blood feuds, which could lead to the complete destruction of entire clans and communities due to incessant strife, and to ensure some symmetry between the punishment and the crime itself, making it understandable, predictable, and, as was then believed, fair. However, in practice, the application of this law was far from simple, literal, and, most importantly, far from fair as it seems at first glance. If we look at it from a modern point of view, its implementation was deeply, absolutely, and unfairly dependent on the social status of all parties to the conflict, both the offender and the victim. This was the cornerstone of many ancient legal systems, enshrining social inequality. If a person of high status, such as a free citizen of Babylon, a member of a noble family, a member of the elite of society, a priest or a large landowner, harmed a person of low status, such as a slave, a commoner, a tenant farmer, or any other person not enjoying full rights, The punishment for the offender was quite different and much, much milder. Instead of literally losing an eye or a tooth, instead of physical injury or suffering, the offender could simply pay a fine or monetary compensation. For example, the same Code of Hammurabi clearly states, if a free man knocked out a free man's tooth, his own tooth would be knocked out in return, the principle of talion in its purest form. But if the same free man knocked out a slave's tooth, he had to pay the slave's owner a certain amount of money, usually 2 minas of silver. This clearly shows that even within the framework of the principle of equal retribution, there was no true equality before the law, since human life, health, and dignity were valued differently depending on the social group to which the victim and the offender belonged. A slave in the legal sense was not considered a person, but solely property, a movable asset, and harm done to him was equivalent to damage to property, not to an attack on the human body or dignity. The purpose of the law in this case was solely to compensate the owner for material damage, not to punish for an attack on human life or health as such, since the slave was not considered to be the bearer of these values in the legal sense. His injury or death was equivalent to the loss of a major investment or valuable asset for the owner. Similar norms that clearly demonstrate class inequality existed in other ancient societies, which testifies to their pervasiveness and rootedness in the social structure. Ancient Roman law, although much more developed, complex, and gradually evolving, also showed significant differences in punishment depending on social status and citizenship. For example, a member of the aristocracy, a patrician, could only be sentenced to exile from the city or confiscation of part of his property for a crime for which a common citizen, plebeian, could be sentenced to physical mutilation, severe corporal punishment, or even death. Non-citizens and slaves, of course, did not have even such minimal rights. This underscores the deep class stratification enshrined in law and ensuring the privileges of the elite. In Hebrew law, as found in the books of the Old Testament, the principle of an eye for an eye also existed, but over time its literal interpretation among the rabbis shifted to financial compensation to avoid literal mutilation, which would be highly impractical, would lead to mass disability, and could lead to an endless chain of mutual mutilations, destroying society. However, the original concept was precisely about physical retaliation, and in certain periods it was applied literally, resulting in mutilation. In Assyrian laws, which were even more cruel, merciless, and archaic than Babylonian ones, women could be punished for certain crimes, such as unauthorized abortion, adultery, disobedience to her husband, not only with physical injuries and mutilation, such as cutting off the nose, ears, or fingers, but also with public humiliation, disgrace, or even death, while men faced much less severe punishment for similar or even more serious crimes, most often just a fine. Thus, the law of talion, which today may seem like a primitive but fair form of retribution, in fact was often not only about limiting revenge, but also a powerful tool for maintaining a rigid social hierarchy and strengthening the power of the upper classes, ensuring their immunity and privileges before the law. It clearly demonstrates the complete absence of the idea of universal, inalienable human rights, where the value of life and dignity of each person is equal regardless of his origin, wealth, profession, religion, or position in society. Today, the concept of an eye for an eye is rejected in most civilized legal systems as inhumane, cruel, ineffective in correcting the criminal and incompatible with the principles of humanism and modern ethics, being replaced by the principles of correction, rehabilitation, re-education, and strict proportionality of punishment, which should correspond to the gravity of the crime, but not necessarily repeat it literally. Modern courts strive to achieve true justice and not blind, literal retribution, which only generates further violence and suffering. The second BALP responsibility for the murder of a slave. In the vast majority of ancient civilizations where slavery existed, and it was almost universal, slaves were not considered full-fledged people in the legal sense of the word. They were not subjects of law, capable of having their own rights, freedoms, owning property, entering into contracts, or acting as witnesses in court. Instead, they were purely property. Movable chattels like livestock, farm tools, household goods, buildings, or land. This meant that the laws regarding slaves regulated their status solely as objects of ownership, as things and not as living sentient beings with any inherent rights or dignity. They could be sold, bartered, given away, bequeathed, or rented out. Killing a slave was thus not considered human murder in the modern sense, but rather the destruction or damage of another's property, which entailed only material damage to the owner, not the penalty for taking his life. If someone killed another's slave, the punishment for the murderer was significantly incomparably lighter than for the murder of a free man. The owner of a murdered slave could receive financial compensation from the murderer, just as if the murderer had damaged his house, broken a valuable tool, or killed a domestic animal such as a cow or a donkey. This compensation was aimed solely at compensating the owner, at making up for his material loss, and not at restoring justice to the slave himself, whose life had no intrinsic value in the eyes of the law and society. It was not connected to the moral condemnation of killing a human being. An example is the already mentioned Code of Hammurabi, where the murder of a slave was subject to a strictly defined fine, which was paid to the slave's owner, rather than the punishment proportionate to the murder of a free person, which could have been punished by death, serious injury, mutilation, or exile. The purpose of the law was solely to compensate the owner for material damage, and not to punish the encroachment on human life as such, since the slave was not considered to be a bearer of these values in the legal sense. His injury or death was equivalent to the loss of a major investment or valuable asset for the owner. For example, the value of a slave could be related to the value of an ox or a field. If a slave was killed by his own master, the situation was even more horrific and disenfranchised. In the vast majority of cases, the master had absolute, complete, and unlimited power over his property, and therefore he could do whatever he wanted with it, including mutilation, beatings, torture, starvation, forced labor, and even murder, without any legal consequences, punishment from the state, or public censure. The slave was completely at the mercy of his master, and his life was not protected by law from the arbitrary will of the owner, who could exercise any cruelty without fear of retribution. This reflects a profound lack of understanding of the inalienable, universal human rights that today form the basis of any modern state governed by the rule of law and international law. The concept that every person, regardless of status, origin, wealth, or position, has an absolute right to life, liberty, and security of person was completely alien to ancient societies where social stratification was rigid, hierarchical, and reinforced by law and sometimes by religious dogma. Religion often justified slavery. Occasionally, in very rare cases and in some cultures, there may have been minimal declaratory restrictions on the killing of slaves, but these were intended to prevent riots, preserve public order, maintain social stability, or protect certain categories of slaves, such as temple slaves, who were considered the property of the gods and therefore under their protection, rather than to protect the rights of the slave as an individual. For example, in late Roman law, over time, some restrictions on particularly cruel treatment of slaves emerged, such as a ban on killing a slave without a valid reason, which was still determined by the owner, or a ban on throwing sick slaves out into the street unattended. But these were the exception rather than the rule, and concerned only the most egregious cases of abuse that could cause discontent among other citizens or create problems for the state. In general, the system of slavery, as enshrined in law, was inhumane and based on a complete lack of legal protection for millions of people whose lives and fates depended on the whim of their owners, who could dispose of them at their own discretion. Today, such laws are recognized as absolute savagery, injustice, and barbarity, since slavery is prohibited throughout the world by international conventions and is considered the gravest crime against humanity, and its revival is unthinkable. The murder of any human being, regardless of his social or economic status, is a grave crime, punishable by severe penalties, and there is no legal basis for depriving a person of his fundamental, inalienable rights. The third was the responsibility of the family for the crime of one of its members. Many ancient societies did not have the modern principle of individual responsibility, which states that only the one who committed the crime should be punished for it, and that no one else, especially innocent people, should suffer for the actions of others. This principle, which is the basis of criminal law today, was completely alien to the ancients. Instead, there was the principle of collective responsibility, or mutual responsibility, whereby the crime of one person could be held responsible for his entire family, his entire clan, tribe, or even the entire community to which he belonged. This principle was especially widespread in archaic legal systems, where the concept of personal identity was less pronounced, and belonging to a family, tribe, or clan played a defining dominant role in a person's life and status. A person was perceived not as a separate independent unit, but as part of a large indivisible collective that bears common responsibility. For example, in some ancient Near Eastern laws, if one member of a family committed a serious crime, such as treason, attempted coercion of the ruler, witchcraft, especially grave murder or other crimes against the state or public morality, the punishment could extend to his wife, children, even infants and nursing children, siblings, parents, and sometimes even distant relatives on both sides who formerly had nothing to do with the crime committed and might not even know about it. This could take the form of execution of the entire family, including innocent women and children, enslavement of all members, stripping of all property, total confiscation, razing the home to the ground, or expulsion from the community without the right to return, often meaning certain death in the wild. Imagine the horror and injustice of innocent children being punished for the crimes of their parents without any understanding or involvement in what happened, suffering for the sins of others. The purpose of such laws was not only to punish the criminal, but also to exert maximum pressure on his entourage in order to prevent similar crimes in the future, through fear for their loved ones and for the entire family, and to eradicate the vicious family, which was considered infected, disgraced, or posing a threat to the stability of society. It was believed that the crime of one person disgraces the entire family, brings a curse upon it, and that only the complete destruction or severe punishment of the entire family can restore order, cleanse society from filth, or appease the angry gods. Examples of this approach, clearly demonstrating the principle of collective responsibility, can be found in various ancient cultures. In some interpretations of the laws of ancient Israel, as set out in the Old Testament, for some particularly serious crimes, e.g., idolatry, blasphemy against God, particularly serious forms of disobedience to authority, not only the guilty person, but also his or her closest relatives could be executed. Although this was a relatively rare and extreme measure, applied in exceptional cases such as total apostasy. In Roman law, although much more developed and based on more individual principles in criminal cases, there were also vestiges of collective responsibility, especially in cases of treason. A traitor's property could be completely confiscated by the state, effectively punishing his family, leaving them without means of support, condemning them to poverty and social exclusion. However, one of the most striking, horrific, and cruel examples of this approach is the practice of execution of 9 generations in ancient China. This was one of the harshest and most cruel forms of punishment for treason, conspiracy against the emperor, rebellion, attempted assassination, or other crimes against absolute power. It provided for the execution of not only the criminal himself, but also his parents, children, brothers, sisters, and relatives on the maternal and paternal lines up to the 9th generation. That is, everyone who had any blood connection with the criminal, even if they lived in other provinces and did not know about his actions. It was the extreme degree of collective responsibility, aimed at the complete merciless destruction of any potential source of rebellion, at the eradication of the very memory of the criminal's family, and at instilling absolute, paralyzing fear of any disobedience to authority. Such laws were intended to instill fear and ensure absolute, unquestioning loyalty, but from the point of view of modern law, they are complete savagery, unjust barbarity, an unthinkable crime against the innocent, and a violation of all norms of humanity. Today, the principle of collective responsibility in criminal law is completely rejected in all civilized countries. Each person is responsible only for his own actions, and punishment cannot be transferred to innocent relatives or other people. This is a fundamental principle of justice, humanism, and the rule of law, which protects the rights of the individual and ensures that no one will suffer for the sins of others, and that only the guilty will suffer the punishment they deserve. The fourth was the law of ordeal, judgment of God, where death was a sentence and survival was a miracle, proving the will of heaven. Ordeals, or judgments of God, were a widespread form of dispute resolution, determining guilt or innocence in ancient and medieval societies, especially in Europe, both in Germanic and Slavic law, as well as in other regions, and in some African and Asian cultures. These trials were based on a deep, unshakable, and naive belief that God, or gods, in polytheistic societies would intervene in the process and indicate guilt or innocence by means of a miraculous sign, a supernatural phenomenon, or direct divine intervention. It was not man who passed the sentence, but the deity itself, using the body of the accused as an instrument or pointing to him through the elements. Thus, the outcome of the ordeal was perceived as an incontestable decision of a higher power. There were many types of ordeals, but all involved causing unbearable pain, suffering, or direct danger to the life of the accused, which was essentially legalized torture dressed up in a religious form. If the hands or feet were not burned, or the burns healed very quickly and without traces, which was practically impossible in the conditions of that time, when there were no asepsis or antiseptics and any wound was easily infected, this was considered a sign of innocence, proof of divine intervention and patronage. Otherwise, the person was found guilty and subjected to further punishment. Another common type was the water trial. The accused, usually tied up so that he could not actively swim and save himself, was thrown into water, a river, a lake, or even a specially dug hole with water. If he drowned, this was considered a sign of innocence, since the clean water accepted his body and his soul could go to heaven. If he floated, which most often happened due to the properties of the body, the presence of air in the clothes or lungs, and also because he could be deliberately not tied very tightly, then he was considered guilty because the water rejected him as an unclean sinner. This method was especially cruel, as innocence meant death and survival meant guilt. There were also poison ordeals, where the accused had to drink a deadly poison or a particularly strong herbal brew, and if he survived, he was considered innocent. Naturally, most people died from the poison, which only confirmed their guilt in the eyes of a superstitious society. Some cultures had combat ordeals or trial duels where two people, the accused and the accuser or their representatives, fought to the death or until one won outright, and it was believed that God would give victory to the right, that is, the one who spoke the truth and had justice on his side. The winner was considered acquitted. Today, such methods of trial seem not just savagery, but barbarity, complete nonsense, and an absolute denial of humanity. They had nothing to do with justice, the search for truth, rational logic, or real evidence. The outcome of the ordeal depended on a multitude of random factors. The physical endurance of the accused, his luck, the skill and integrity of the ordeal executor, who could help or hinder the accused depending on his prejudices or external pressure, and most often, on the strength of faith and the level of suggestibility of the people who conducted this trial and interpreted its results. In essence, these were legalized tortures, disguised as a religious ritual, which in the vast majority of cases resulted in the death or severe, irreversible injury of the accused, regardless of his actual guilt. An innocent person who went through such a procedure would almost certainly receive serious injuries, remain disabled for life, or die, becoming a victim of an absurd system. Justice here was entirely in the hands of blind chance, deeply rooted superstitions and arbitrariness, and not in the hands of the law. The absence of any logic, common sense, or evidence in such trials is absolutely unacceptable from the point of view of modern law and ethics. Indeed, modern justice is based on the careful collection of evidence, witness testimony, logical analysis of facts, expert opinions, and the fundamental presumption of innocence, where the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, not the accused, and the accused has the right to a defense and a fair trial. Ordeals, on the other hand, required the accused to prove his innocence by exposing himself to mortal danger and unbearable suffering, which would have been tantamount to self-execution. The abandonment of ordeals, which began around the 12th and 13th centuries AD, for example, in the Fourth Lateran Council, formally banned priests from participating in ordeals, depriving them of legitimacy and the support of the Church, was one of the most important steps towards the development of rational justice based on reason rather than superstition and cruelty. It was an important step away from medieval thinking towards a more enlightened one. The fifth law was trials of animals and inanimate objects. One of the most bizarre, today completely absurd and even comical, but at the same time tragic and horrific practices of ancient and medieval European legal systems were trials of animals and even inanimate objects. This may seem incredible, almost fiction or a plot from a fantasy work, but historical documents confirm. In Europe, starting from about the 9th century and up until the 18th century, full-fledged trials were held for animals that, in people's opinion, committed crimes. Pigs, cows, donkeys, dogs, rats, caterpillars, locusts, field mice, moles, and even snails could be officially accused of various crimes. For example, a pig could be accused of killing a child if it trampled or bit him, a dog of stealing food or attacking a person, rats of destroying crops in the fields, caterpillars and locusts of invading crops and ruining entire provinces, and moles of spoiling root crops. The animal brought before the court was assigned a lawyer to defend it. Witnesses were presented, often people who had suffered at the hands of the animal or had witnessed its crime. Detailed minutes of the proceedings were kept, arguments for and against were heard, and finally a formal sentence was passed. The sentence could range from the death penalty, e.g., by hanging a pig, burning a cow, burying a dog alive, to excommunication from the community or excommunication from the church in the case of insects, which were considered the spawn of the devil and could therefore be subject to ecclesiastical judgment. For example, in Switzerland, a pig was officially sentenced to death by hanging for the murder of a child, and the sentence was carried out publicly in the presence of a large number of spectators. In France, rats were accused of damaging crops and were even summoned to trial, which, however, was postponed due to their illness and inability to attend, which speaks of a kind of legal logic and an attempt to apply human norms to animals. Trials were also held for inanimate objects that caused the death or serious injury of a person. For example, if a person died after falling from a ladder, the ladder could be accused of murder and sentenced to be destroyed, burned, broken into pieces, or confiscated for the benefit of the treasury. If a person was killed by a falling stone that came off a mountain or wall, the stone could be broken into small pieces or thrown into a river so that it would not cause harm to anyone else. If a knife was used in a murder, it could be executed. Why was this done? Such practices were based on deep superstitions, religious beliefs, and the complete inability of ancient and medieval people to rationally explain the cause of accidents, diseases, epidemics, and natural phenomena such as droughts, floods, pest infestations. It was believed that any misfortune, death, illness, or natural disaster, even if it occurred, in our opinion, by chance, must be the result of someone's fault, be it a person, an animal, or even an animate object, which was possessed by an evil spirit, the devil, or which was under the influence of dark forces. Thus, the trial of an animal or an object was an attempt to find the culprit, punish him, and restore justice in the eyes of society, and perhaps to appease the gods or drive away evil spirits in order to avoid a repetition of such misfortunes and restore order to the universe. From the point of view of modern law, such trials are absolutely absurd, ridiculous, and have no rational basis. Animals do not have free will, consciousness, moral choice, and cannot be legally responsible for their actions, which are only a manifestation of instincts, hunger, or a defensive reaction. Inanimate objects have no consciousness, no will, and cannot be guilty of anything, since they lack the ability to choose and act on their own initiative. Modern justice is based on the concept of human guilt, on their free will and awareness of their actions, as well as on the causal relationship of their actions with the crime, and not on superstition or attributing guilt to irrational beings or inanimate things. These examples clearly show how far humanity has advanced in rational thinking, in the development of logic, and in separating justice from mysticism, prejudice, and archaic beliefs. It is also a reminder of the dangers of mixing religion and justice without clear boundaries and a secular approach. And the last was the law of paternal authority in ancient Rome. This is absolute control over life, death, and fate, as over property. Paternal authority was one of the most fundamental, comprehensive, and powerful institutions of ancient Rome, forming the very basis of the Roman family and the whole society. It is one of the most striking, visual, and, from a modern point of view, frightening examples of the absolute and unprecedented legal control that one man, the father of the family, could have over all the other members of his family, essentially as over his own property. This law gave the head of the family almost absolute and unlimited power over everyone who was under his control, not only over his wife, who, however, could often have her own property and rights, but also over children, regardless of their age, even if they were adults, held high government positions, had their own families, children and grandchildren, as well as over all the slaves who were part of his family. This power was so vast and pervasive that it included the right of life and death. That is, a father could legally, without any legal process, state intervention or subsequent punishment, kill his children, regardless of their age, sex, or merit. Although this right was rarely exercised in practice, public opinion generally frowned upon such extreme measures, and its application to adult children with political or social influence would have been virtually impossible and likely to cause unrest. The very fact of its legal existence in law speaks to the incredible degree of control and the complete lack of rights that family members had in relation to the head. The paterfamilias also had the right to sell his children into slavery 3 times in a row, after which the child became free from his power, and to sell his children into marriage with anyone he wanted, or to give them up for adoption to another paterfamilias. He could refuse to recognize a newborn, not to lift the child from the ground, which symbolized his abandonment and meant his death or abandonment to his fate outside the home, where he often died from cold, hunger, or wild animals. Children, even if they were 40, 50, or 60 years old, could not independently enter into contracts, marry without his consent, own property, or dispose of their bodies, fate, or careers without the will of their father. They were eternal minors in the legal sense, completely subordinate to the will of the head of the family. The father could also marry off his daughter or his son against their will, and also divorce his children, even if they were happily married, if it was beneficial to the family. He could dispose of their lives and fate at his own discretion, which was an absolute and indisputable right, enshrined by the state. The death of the paterfamilias was the only way to free the children from his power, and only then did they become sui juris, that is, of their own right, or independent, becoming full-fledged subjects of Roman law and receiving the ability to own property and enter into transactions. This law was aimed at strengthening family ties in the understanding of the Romans, maintaining a rigid social hierarchy, ensuring unquestioning obedience and stability of the entire Roman society. It reflected the deeply patriarchal nature of Roman society, where the authority of the man and head of the family was absolute and inviolable, and the state interfered little in family affairs, granting the father almost unlimited powers. Today, such a law would be considered complete savagery and a gross violation of all modern concepts of the rights of the child, human rights, personal freedom, and autonomy of the individual. Modern law is based on the recognition of each person as an independent subject of law, possessing personal freedoms, the right to personal inviolability, to marry by one's own choice, to own property, to work, and to be protected from violence and tyranny. Parental authority today is strictly limited to concern for the child's welfare, upbringing, education, and protection, and not absolute control over his life and death. The idea that a father can decide the fate of adult children is completely alien and unthinkable for a modern legal state, where adulthood gives a person full legal capacity and independence from parental will, although not from their support and love. Thus, Patria Potestas is a clear testimony to the colossal evolution of legal and ethical norms, as well as the understanding of the role of the family and the individual in society. Studying these ancient laws, which today seem not just strange but downright bizarre to us, is not just a dive into historical curiosities or an attempt to denigrate the past in order to exalt the present. It is a profound and profoundly important lesson about how far humanity has come in its understanding of justice, universal human rights, and the intrinsic value of every single life. From brutal forms of retribution that knew no equality before the law and were based solely on social status and privilege, to the complete lack of rights for millions of people who were considered mere property without any legal or moral rights. From absurd trials of animals and even inanimate objects that reflected deep superstitions, the inability to rationally explain the world and the fear of the unknown, to the absolute and unlimited power of the head of the family over the life and death of its members. These ancient norms clearly show that concepts that we today take for granted and are fundamental to any civilized society, such as the equality of all before the law, individual responsibility for the actions committed, the presumption of innocence, when a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. The right to life, liberty, and security of person, as well as the absolute prohibition of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, are the result of a long, often painful, bloody, and painstaking evolution of human thought, social consciousness, and a constant, tireless struggle for justice and recognition of universal human dignity. These rights and principles were not given to us from above or invented in one day. They were suffered, won, and gradually implemented over many centuries at the cost of enormous effort, suffering, and sacrifice. These ancient laws were a vivid reminder of the fragility of human existence, where life and death, freedom and slavery, well-being and suffering were often determined not by justice, not by the arguments of reason, but by social status, chance, the arbitrariness of power, or even blind superstition and religious dogma. They reflected a world where magic, religion, and mysticism played a huge, dominant role in everyday life, and justice was often based on the belief in divine intervention, fortune-telling, dangerous trials, or the personal whim of the ruler, rather than on rational analysis of facts, logic, and objective evidence. What we today perceive as the inalienable, universal rights of every person were unheard of luxuries, available only to a very select few, and for the majority of the population were just a pipe dream, often out of reach throughout their lives. Understanding this monumental evolution helps us to appreciate more deeply modern legal systems, which, despite their inevitable shortcomings, imperfections, and challenges, strive to ensure true justice, protect the rights of every individual, and create a more humane, compassionate, and just society. It is a powerful reminder that progress is not always linear, that it does not come easily, and that constant reflection, critical re-evaluation, and continuous improvement of our laws, ethics, and social norms are vital to the maintenance of civilization. We must remember the savagery and cruelty of the past, not to condemn ancient people from the heights of our modernity, but to learn from it and prevent its return in the modern world. We must tirelessly continue to strive to build a world where the rights and dignity of every person are valued above all else, regardless of origin, nationality, race, wealth, profession, religion, or social status. Ultimately, these ancient laws, no matter how bizarre they may seem today, are an integral part of our shared human history, teaching us important and enduring lessons about the nature of power, about justice, about the limits of human cruelty, and about humanity's constant, relentless pursuit of a better, more just and humane future. They serve as a powerful warning against a return to archaic forms of thinking and justice, where power, status, prejudice, and ignorance prevail over humanity, reason, and equality, and remind us that the path to progress is a constant work on ourselves and on society, requiring vigilance, self-analysis, and continuous development. This is our common challenge, necessary for the future.